The piece that I did recently for UnHerd is it sort of asks one of these many unasked questions. We've had so much falsehood and misinformation, as we call it today, thrown at us about the pandemic. The result is that we haven't even asked some very fundamental questions, such as why was America's foreign aid agency, USAID, funding research in Wuhan at all? And when you look at it and you start kind of putting into context, so I know a lot of the journalists in this space and a lot of the drastic people have really done excellent stuff with data and databases and sequences and things that are very important to the record. But unfortunately, that most news readers, most people following this issue simply just they can't track it. It's very sophisticated and very difficult, but they can track the institutional story. They can understand stories that have to do with power and influence and corruption. That stuff, we've all kind of been educated to understand what it means and how to follow it. And that's what this story is really all about. I mean, this is about a foreign aid agency spending huge amounts of money. I mean, we're talking no less than $65 million funneled through EcoHealth Alliance from USAID. And, the question there you have to ask is to what end? What was the purpose? What I do in this piece is just offer some of that context. And a lot of this funding goes back to George Bush, who really put in place America's biodefense infrastructure and strategy in the early 2000s. And to be honest, it was led by Dick Cheney, who came in with a lot of foreboding about the future of biodefense and bioterrorism, bioweapons. And of course, and this was sort of, we didn't really go too much into this in the piece, but a notion of what strategic depth meant from a weapons point of view, which means developing weapons like nuclear weapons were developed in the 1940s that could not just sort of cripple an enemy's military capability, but disrupt their society totally. And bioweapons have a unique ability to do that. They were thinking a lot about this kind of stuff in early 2000s. 2004, they put in place something called biodefense in the 21st century. And that was a presidential directive that laid out the framework for America's biodefense strategy. And along with it, a massive ramp up in funding. USAID was sort of I would say, put into that framework in some regard. So Andrew Natsios was a longtime Bush ally and political hand, was put in place as administrator of USAID in those early days. And he starts making some very consequential changes at the agency, including opening an Office of Military Affairs. So that would be the office that would cooperate with Department of Defense. There was someone I quote in the piece who was a professor of conflict studies saying that Bush turned USAID into a quasi-security agency, which is a pretty bold claim. But that was backed up by another USAID administrator named Henrietta Fore, who was saying that there was a period where military personnel, uniformed personnel, were appearing in the hallways of USAID headquarters to an extent they had never seen before. And this is all happening right around the time that Dennis Carroll becomes a part of USAID from CDC. And he was brought over to lead the flu efforts there. And that's where he launches this program called PREDICT, which is given a $200 million budget over a 10-year period. And the mission, at least in part, is to go out and find new viruses that can become pandemics, which is what they did. And, this is where you have to pause for a moment. And Emily Kopp, another reporter in this space, asked this question on Twitter today, which is, why was a foreign aid organization looking for viruses that could start a pandemic? What business do they have doing that? It's a really strange mission to spend money on. So this is what they're doing. They're not just looking for viruses that exist in the wild. They're also helping, or at least funding, labs that were trying to make these viruses, including in Wuhan. They were directing money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology via EcoHealth Alliance. And there was one study in particular in 2015, Ralph Barrick and Shixing Li, who in this study developed what the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists would later liken to a prototype for making SARS-CoV-2 in a lab. And that study was deemed so dangerous that the authors did not upload the genetic sequence of the chimeric virus to GenBank. And this is stuff that was being funded by USAID. So you got to ask, what were they doing? Looking for viruses, funding research to create new viruses that could cause a pandemic. Not only that, the real kicker, though, is why were they funding it in China, in a lab where the US government knew the Chinese military had a presence? The only way we can start to disentangle this is if we add another layer of context, which goes back to the Biodefense in the 21st Century Directive. That's a strategic framework. That's a all of government strategy that included intelligence gathering. That was key to being able to protect America from biodefense threats. You had to know what the other guys were doing in their labs. How do you get into those labs? That's the question. How do you do that kind of intelligence gathering in labs that could easily fit in place in a college campus or any other kind of research facility, and blend in very easily, camouflage very easily? And the other thing that was going on at USAID was that they, in the 2000s and as recently as 2014, they were working with the CIA to develop operations on the ground, including in Cuba. The AP exposed an operation where they worked with the CIA directly to create a sort of fake Twitter, Cuban Twitter, that would be able to gather data on the regime and also influence public opinion in order to overthrow the Castro regime, presumably, which of course backfired as it would. They were also doing similar stuff with against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Again, this would be stuff that really borders on stuff the CIA would do and does, and in some cases this was done directly with the CIA. So they are no strangers to working with intelligence agencies and the intelligence community, and this is a long history that goes back to the 60s at very least. So there is enough context that the government in general was looking to be doing this kind of surveillance and intelligence gathering, and USAID is definitely a part of that framework. And there they are funding this kind of very dangerous research in a lab in China where there was Chinese military personnel. Side by side, a researcher doing some very advanced stuff on bat-borne coronaviruses, as we now know. So, this is where we start to ask those questions, and we don't have answers, and we're probably not going to get those direct answers, in large part because there is such a high degree of protection. I mean, when you watch the testimony of Samantha Power, who is the current USAID administrator, and, Rand Paul is asking her questions about why USAID, or not even why, what USAID was funding in Wuhan, if they were funding coronavirus research, and she won't even answer the question.
Ms. Powers, did USAID fund coronavirus research in Wuhan, China?
We did not fund gain of function research, as you know.
And the question is, did you fund coronavirus research in Wuhan, China?
Before my time, there was the PREDICT program with which you're familiar, which ended in China in 2019.
Has USAID awarded funds to the Academy of Military Medical Sciences in China?
Not to my knowledge, but I'd have to.
I think the answer is once again yes. We want to read the grants to find out what they were doing and whether the research was dangerous or not. The response I got from your agency was, USAID will not be providing any documents at this time. And 20 million people died from a virus, and you won't give us the basic information about what grants you're funding around the world, who you're funding.
Consistent with longstanding practice, we have been responsive to the committees of jurisdiction.
You've been consistent in not giving us any information. So we want to know, are there other research proposals that you either granted or denied that were on the same veins of creating viruses that could have become COVID-19? We can't tell because you won't give us the information.
Again, consistent with longstanding practice, we are providing extensive documentation. We have a whole
Just not trillion.
We are
Dishonest. You're being dishonest. And you haven't gotten one scrap of paper from you.
Again, with the committees of jurisdiction, we are providing all of the paperwork.
You are not.
Requested by
I'm on the other committee. I'm the ranking member on the other committee, and I haven't seen a scrap of paper from that committee either.
Well, that is.
Here's what the American.
Tell you what. I can't tell you what.
The American people think this: that because you won't respond, and because you respond with a non-response, that you have something to hide. I don't know if you have anything to hide or not. I want to see every grant proposal that had to do with coronaviruses that went to China from the U.S. government, from all facets of the U.S. government, and every bit of the Biden administration is stonewalling us and will not give us the information. It makes us think and makes us suspicious that you're hiding something.
You know, he's complaining that they won't deliver documents related to the grants that they were making. And she doesn't feel a need to because she feels a need to not answer those questions because something is happening, because something is going on. Clearly, what it is exactly, we don't yet know. What we know is that we have in front of us a mosaic. We have pieces of a very intricate puzzle. What it adds up to exactly, it's hard to say. But I think there is a picture that is compelling and disturbing. And I think this is what I was really focused on in this article, is say, all right, we can't be too shy about what questions we're willing to ask. We have to present the facts. We have to present information that's reliable. It has to be reliably sourced. We never want to stray too far and just start, making things up and speculating. But on the other side of that, we also have to be willing to take a small risk and to say, let's just think deductively. We start with the premises about USAID, about COVID-19, about the kind of research that was being funded by the United States government in these Chinese labs, and think what might be the possible outcome or conclusion that we can draw from this. And that's what this piece is really doing.